So before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to give a plug for what you have there in front of you, which is our annual forum. So the annual forum is going to take place on April 25th at the Eisman Center. It's an all-day event. Our theme this year is about how to engage family in school for early education. So this is one I'm sure speaks to a lot of us here. We have a great keynote speaker, Christine McWade, coming in from Tufts University. We have a fabulous panel of community leaders here who are working with this issue of involving parents in equitable and culturally responsive ways, including people from Uplift Education, Big Thought, area ISDs. So we're going to have a lecture. We're also going to have open discussion about how kind of the barriers and ways that people are addressing this and making sure families are involved in that education to help children thrive. So I really hope you're able to join us for that event. That actually leads in really well to our speaker today. So it's my pleasure to present Dr. Michael Siller, who is here from UNT, where he is the executive director of the Kristen Farmer Autism Center. He comes to UNT after having faculty positions at both Hunter College and then at Emory. His work really looks at the ability to study how children with autism develop and learn. He's particularly interested in learning that takes place in familiar daily routines and in natural environmental settings. So he's had research that includes longitudinal studies to look at children's development, intervention trials, including some that have a really strong play-based intervention, and implementation science to make sure that evidence-based practices can be used within the community. So as the director of the Kristen Farmer Autism Center, he is striving to integrate clinical and educational services and aims to support the implementation of evidence-based practices in community settings. His research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health and numerous private foundations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Siller. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Well, thanks for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Gotta point the camera. The talk that I'm presenting today is not so different from the job talk that I gave a few years back. And in a job talk, you sort of allow yourself to reflect a little bit bigger. So I'm not going to present you that many new data, but more sort of try to think with you a little bit about naturalistic teaching and learning for kids with autism, where that concept, that idea has come from, where it's at right now and where it needs to go. And I sort of interweave the research that I've done into that story. So I'll be talking about decades worth of research. I know I'm listed here some of the staff and collaborators I've had in the past. I know you guys all know Megan Swanson, who was faculty here not too long ago. But many people have contributed to this work over decades. Connie Casari, Daniel Messenger, Lindy Morgan, Paul Yoder, lots of people have been part of this. And it's been funded by a range of different organizations, and I'm now faculty at UNT. So I was going to start with this paper, which now is 10 years old. And it was sort of the result of lots of conversations within the field. The way I've experienced it was that in 2007, the Academy of Pediatrics started coming out with guidelines for screening for autism. So they were screening all these 18-month-old and 24-month-olds, and Autism Speaks realized that we really didn't have good evidence for intervention for this age group, so they funded a research network of early intervention researchers. And in that research network, probably other places too, we sort of realized, because we were a very disciplinary group of scientists speaking different language, that we all did very similar things. And a lot of that consensus was articulated in this paper. So central to this paper, where they coined the term naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, we sort of bring developmental and behavioral approaches together. Central to all of that is the idea that children with autism, to the extent possible, should learn we should embed their learning opportunities in natural environments. And natural environments means, on the one hand, that it should be activities that are familiar and meaningful to them. And it also means that it's embedded in relationships with people that are meaningful to them as well. So where that shift towards that consensus, to that NDBI framework came from, I don't think is completely obvious. There's certainly some empirical evidence that kids learn the best when learning opportunities are embedded in interactions and activities that are meaningful to them. But there's probably more to the shift. I mean, it probably has to do with social models of disability and sort of an understanding that we want to include our children in naturalistic settings. Part of it, I think, came from the idea of active engagement, that one of the challenges that kids with autism have is that it's just hard for them to bring them in settings where they spend a lot of their day learning. So how do we make sure that kids with autism are actively engaged in learning for, I don't know, 25, 30 hours a week? And there aren't that many ways to accomplish that. The ABA field sort of has their tiered systems where they have behavior technicians who implement interventions under supervision of more trained people. The naturalistic developmental behavioral approach sort of was, well, maybe we can train parents and teachers to embed some of these things. So I think it had to do with just how do we do service delivery for kids with autism, where we all sort of realize they need a lot of learning opportunities that they don't necessarily find themselves. And at the same time, also implementation science became really important in intervention research in autism, where we started to think much more, not just how do we design smart interventions, but how do we actually help providers find these interventions useful and incorporate them into their practice. So again, sort of the science of how we teach teachers to implement strategies, or how we train parents to do things, was sort of emerging at the same time. So I think all of this really came together in this, it's almost like a paradigmatic shift in how we think about interventions for kids with autism. Now I have to say, we were just talking about INSAR, the International Society for Autism Research, which has had these annual conferences for 20 years, I think. So when you go to that conference, people talk about NDBIs left and right. So those are the federally funded autism researchers. But for a while, I sort of thought that that was the consensus, but I don't think it is. I think this idea of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, there are other even research communities, for example, in the ABA field, where that's not a concept that's being taught or thought about as much as I would think. I was going to use this talk to talk you through sort of some of the research that I've done, some of it sort of leading up to this paper, not that it was the cause of it, and some of the work that I've done afterwards. So I'll talk first some about how you embed naturalistic learning opportunities when you're training or supporting parents. And then I'll talk about how that could look like in preschool settings. I'll tell you about some inclusive preschool work that I've done. And finally, I'll say just a few words from my experiences at the Kristen Farmer Autism Center, which which is not an inclusive setting. It's a building for kids with autism that, for the most part, provides ABA treatment, and how to make NDBIs work in that setting is sort of the new frontier, at least in my life. All right, so I'll start by talking a little bit about parents. And this work really goes back quite far. So this is Marian Sigmund, my mentor as a graduate student. When I came to work with her in the late, I think in '97, we were trying to think about research projects. And I went in the basement. At the time, she was doing this longitudinal follow-up of kids that she's seen 15 years earlier as preschoolers, who she now saw again as adults. And I went in the basement and looked at and found a box of videotapes that showed the same parents interacting with their kids when they were 3 and 4 and 5 years of age. And I started looking at those videotapes because from my sort of clinical experience at the time, I came from Germany and we had sort of international students, and I had worked in clinics over there. And over there, we talked a lot about not so much structured teaching, but what it is to engage in a playful dialogue with children and to be responsive to them and all of that. So I decided to look at these videotapes of parents playing with their children to see, can I see individual differences in how parents play with their children? Are there maybe some parents who spend more time paying attention to what children are interested in, joining what children are doing, and are there other parents who find more structured ways of engaging their children? So I called this responsive parental communication. So I coded this in these 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, and then Marion had the data for how their language unfolded for a decade and a half afterwards. And we were all blown away by the strength of the correlation, the extent to which parent responsive behaviors that we observed during just 4 minutes of play in preschool predicted language outcomes 16 years down the road. And this is, we did our best to control for variables that we had measured, which were a lot. And it really didn't explain this. So to us, it seemed there was this fairly robust prediction, which to a developmental psychologist isn't a surprising prediction to make. But for the field as a whole, I think it was a surprising prediction because the assumption at the time was that kids need a lot of structure, a lot of structured teaching. So that was sort of my first sort of endeavor in thinking about parents, and we then replicated this finding. Sorry. Oh yeah. So there's an interesting developmental theory that we used at the time to explain a finding like this. So kids with autism have specific difficulties with joint attention. That's sort of Marion's contribution. So kids with autism find it harder to recognize where other people are paying attention to, and find it harder to share their own experiences with other people by pointing things out that they like. So in typical development, there's an interesting progression, where around 15 months, kids start to pay a lot of attention to other people's attentional cues. So they become aware of where the parent is looking at. So when the parent says the word cow, and they notice the parent is looking at a cow, they use that kind of contextual information to interpret the language that they hear. So starting at 15-month, kids do that, but before they do that, their language development is much more dependent on parents being responsive and talk about what children are paying attention to. And in kids with autism, that was our hypothesis, because they have this joint attention difficulty, so they may be less inclined to pay attention to other people's attentional cues or contextual cues overall, that they really need an extra dose of parental responsiveness to kickstart their language development. So we did a subsequent study where we sort of replicated this in a new longitudinal sample, this time not over 15 years, because I needed to go through graduate school, but 4 years. And we found exactly that if we looked at children's language trajectories, there were 2 robust predictors. One was children's ability to respond to others' bids for joint attention, meaning their inclination to look when other people showed them things. And the other was the extent to which parents were responsive to children's attention by talking about things that their children were interested in or already doing. Obviously, longitudinal research is challenging to interpret because we don't know causation. And in many ways, both of these studies were, even though replicated, were a surprising finding at the time. And at this point, looking back, it's always surprising to think how surprising it was, but it really was surprising at the time. So then Marion and I decided we wanted to develop an intervention and turn this into intervention research. And we at the time didn't think we were developing or didn't plan on developing a clinical intervention that we intended to scale in any way. That was actually not on my radar at all. The idea was to develop a surgical intervention where we change one specific thing about what parents do and see whether that has an impact for children's development down the road. So even though I took a lot of care in developing the intervention, and I really tried to make it very appealing and well developed, the idea that this would be a product that we would try to scale and implement at scale was not our intention at the time. So I'll tell you in a second about this intervention. We called it focused playtime intervention at the time. So this was the early 2000s when we developed this. And we've done since 2 RCTs to test this intervention. And I'm telling you about this body of work because there have been lots of other parent-mediated interventions in autism since. And I would argue that the findings are all very consistent and not so different from what we had found. So we had done 2 RCTs. The first RCT was between 2001 and 2007, so that was at UCLA. And then there was a follow-up RCT that I did collaboratively with Connie Casari, where there was a site at UCLA and a site at Hunter College. The studies were both decently sample-sized. The first one was single site, the second one was multi-site. The first one had older kids, so at the time we were looking for 3 to 7-year-olds. What was interesting about this sample, because we had this idea that this kind of responsive language is particularly important for kids during early stages of language development, we really looked for nonverbal kids with autism. For the most part, how we exactly defined nonverbal, we can talk more about, but for the most part, they were kids with very limited language skills. The second study was the Autism Speaks funded sample, so those were toddlers at high risk for autism, so they were much younger. In both studies, we had active control groups. So I'll tell you a little bit about the intervention, and then I'll give you a big picture of the findings. So it was called Focused Playtime Intervention. We had beautiful drawings and a very nice parent workbook. It was structured like many of these interventions, 12 sessions, so it wasn't endlessly long. We used some didactic education. We used lots of video feedback, probably more than other interventions, where we videotaped ourselves, we videotaped the parents, spent some time looking at those videotapes to learn and try things out. It was manualized, we had fidelity checks, a workbook, so some of the workbook pages are on the right here. So there was some more didactic, even highly illustrated pages. It was a workbook, so parents took notes, so we took notes during the sessions. Some data collection was even in there, where we paid attention to how we talked to the children. Some homework sheets with homework assignments for the parents to do. It was overall a very family-centered approach. It happened in children's natural environments at home. We very much took care in seeing parents as partners rather than having sort of an expert model where we came in and told parents what to do. It was a very collaborative way of figuring out what works for that specific child with the parents. Lots of reflection and self-evaluation. Like many of these parent coaching intervention, we had this block pyramid structure. Project Impact, which is another one of these interventions, has this triangle structure or pyramid structure. Amy Weatherby, which you guys probably all. So I was just talking about this pyramid structure or the layer cake. I think what a lot of these NDBI parent coaching interventions do is they start with focusing on engagement. And it's not until the higher tiers of it where we talk to parents about sort of high quality teaching episodes. So the bottom layers of this are have a lot of focus on responsiveness, on parents following children's lead, joining children's play. And it's not until we have the children's engagement captured that we start creating more and more opportunities for prompting and nudging specific target behaviors. So it had that structure as well. We've published a whole bunch of papers on it, and it's really hard to think about intervention efficacy, I find. And what makes it so hard, and this, I put here a paper by Michelle Sandbank, who did sort of a wonderful way of sort of framing this, where it's not just do we have evidence that it works, but we're thinking about what does it actually work for. So thinking about the outcomes is very important. What kind of outcomes are we looking for? And she has these two concepts. One is boundedness, meaning to what extent do outcomes generalize, and also proximity, meaning if we work on joint attention, do we really see language gains down the road? So Michelle Sandbank and lots of people have sort of thought about intervention outcomes almost like sort of from the more proximal side. So at the very proximal end, if you work with parents, you may change the way parents think and feel. If you go a step further, maybe you change how parents interact with their children. If you go a step further, maybe you see children communicating differently with their parents. If you go a step further, maybe you see children also demonstrating the new skills with people they don't know. And if you go further, you can look at school outcomes. So I think when we think about intervention efficacy, we really need to think about what outcome we're talking about. And a lot of the NDBI parent coaching intervention have sort of done this. And if I sort of look at this body of work that came from this research is, well, parent cognitions and emotions change. Parents are reflective and much more thoughtful and observant about their child and also about the behaviors that they did themselves. We did these wonderful qualitative interviews with parents before and after where we asked them to talk about what their child is thinking, look at videos and tell us what her child is thinking or feeling. And these conversations became much richer after the intervention than they were before. We had very nice treatment effects on parent behavior. So parents became, or really learned the skill to use these responsiveness-based strategies when interacting with their kids. We had some impact on how children interacted with their parents. One of the findings that we did the strange situation. You guys know this attachment measure? So essentially the way it works, I mean, there's sort of the series of separations. Usually you do it with 2-year-olds, and parents leave the room and come back, and you sort of look at how kids react when parents come back after a brief departure. And Marion had done this work. Marion Sigmund had always done this work with kids with autism, showing that kids with autism are more similar than typical developing kids in their attachment relationships than different. So we looked at these measures and looked at how children reunited with their parents after brief separation and found that due to the intervention, they were much more likely to parents when they came back and more likely to seek proximity to their parent or be less likely to be avoidant of their parent. So we had very nice treatment effects there. In terms of interactions with an assessor, we had some evidence of language gains or treatment effect on language, although it was moderated. And it was moderated along the lines that I theoretically outlined earlier, which is it really had the biggest impact on language gains for the kids who didn't talk at all in the beginning, for the kids who were in the early stages of language development, or later, who had phrase speech. This kind of responsive language input seemed to be less necessary to accomplish engagement or to promote language. And we don't know about school outcomes. So I think to me this is sort of an interesting way to think about it. In many ways it's a humbling way, because obviously Maren and I jumped in and said we would have big language outcomes on children's development, and that didn't turn out to be the case. Looking back, it's not surprising with 12 sessions of a very low dose, very specific intervention. But I think overall that's what the parent coaching literature on autism, at least I think, is sort of a story that we all tell. So lots of confidence that we change how parents interact with children. Some confidence that, at least for some parents, some confidence that we change nuances in parent-child communication. And in terms of generalized language outcomes, some people find it, some people don't find it. And it seems to be in part linked to how intense the treatment was. So that was my first stab at thinking about naturalistic learning for kids with autism. And that was at UCLA and then at Hunter College. And then I started my job at Emory, where I started together with Lindy Morgan, who is the student of Amy Weatherby. And one of the things that we tackled was we said, we're going to start an inclusive laboratory preschool. So we started this program called, which ended up being called the Louis and Brett Samsky Preschool at Marcus. And the idea was to really take a look at how early childhood education could look for kids with autism. And with the idea of having sort of a model project in an academic setting, and that guides our thinking of how we take ideas from that then back to community preschools. There are a number of university-affiliated inclusive laboratory preschools for kids with autism out there. The oldest probably being the Walden School, also at Emory. Project Data, Eileen Schwartz's project, and a number of other projects since. I think what set us apart from a lot of these is that we designed it as a preschool first. This was not, we did not bill for clinical services for these children. It was just a preschool. Our staff were not autism interventionists, they were preschool teachers. And we sort of tried to stick within that framework because we thought if this is ever supposed to generalize to the community, we need to sort of work in that setting as well. So we ended up with 3 classrooms, a classroom for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds. Each classroom had 6 kids with autism in them. And then the 2-year-old classroom had 6 typical developing kids. The 4-year-old classroom had 12 typical developing kids. So the class size grew a little bit over time. Each classroom was staffed with 3 teachers. So there was 1 lead teacher and 2 assistant teachers in each classroom. It was, for the most part, a tuition-funded classroom or program, so parents paid tuition for the 2- and 3-year-old classrooms. For the 4-year-old classroom, we had a pre-K grant through the state, so their parents didn't pay. So that was sort of our overall structure of this program, and I think it's different. So it's different than when you have programs that, like the Easter Seals program here. It's sort of a hybrid between preschool and ABA. This is not what this was. This was a preschool program. One of the challenges with this model, obviously, is that not every kid not every kid with autism may be a good fit for this program. So I think what it meant for us to really be mindful of, if we have a setting like this, where we have 3 teachers working with 12 kids, 6 with autism, we needed to be very intentional about who we offered this to. And I think the truth is a lot of inclusion preschool programs do this. You know, we are all thinking about who are the kids who are the good fit for this program. And if the teachers don't do it, the parents sure do that thinking. And when you talk to preschool directors about which 2-year-olds inclusion programs are good for, which kids with 2-year-olds with autism inclusion programs are good for, it's clinical judgment. I don't think we have very good understanding of that. To us, it seemed like we wanted to recruit children who paid attention to other kids in the room. So we needed the children, we looked for children who were aware of what else was going on in the room. We looked for children who had started to communicate. And if that was just a few gesture, I mean, eye contact important, directing communication, even vocal communication with eye contact. We wanted to see some seedling of children starting to communicate. We looked for some play skills. Obviously, that sort of depended a little bit at the age at which they entered our program. But we wanted them to be able to be good play partners for the typical developing kids as well. And over time, we looked also for behavioral challenges, although mostly for the typical developing peers, actually, because we got lots of parents with behaviorally challenged children who wanted to be part of this inclusion program as well. So this was sort of our program, the way we designed it. We used a preschool curriculum and put CERTs on top. CERTs places a lot of emphasis on social communication and emotion regulation goals. So we sort of followed that approach. And we also started thinking a lot about active engagement. And really, that's the term that we used when we talked to the teachers a lot. What does it mean for children with autism to be actively engaged? How can I see that? What can I, as a teacher, make sure that children are actively engaged in learning during different routines? And when we then sort of, after doing this for a while, took this model and tried to offer to communities in the community, or preschools in the community, that's sort of the terminology that we used. So I'll tell you now about a project that we did. So this was the Samsky preschool. Lindy Morgan, a former student of Amy Weatherby, was, my partner in crime in this. Emily Rubin at the time, also a former collaborator of Amy Weatherby, or a current collaborator, was at Marcus at the time. Also at the time, Emily Rubin had worked in public schools a lot, and she had developed this framework that she calls the SEEKS model, which sort of was very important for us as well in how we thought about our Samsky preschool as well. And the SEEKS model also, it's designed as a intervention that takes seriously the autism concepts that we think about, social communication challenges, active engagement, and offers that to teachers in general education settings. So we did some blend of Emily Rubin's SEEKS model and our experiences from the Samsky school to package it for preschools in the community. At the time, there was this Lancet article that came out about evidence-based interventions for kids with autism, and they advocated very strongly for sort of a step care approach to providing supports for kids with autism. So we thought about it in those terms. Let's engage preschool teachers. Let's have them think about the children in their classroom. Let's think about what those teachers can offer to make sure all kids are engaged in learning. And if that's not enough, maybe we need other support. So it was sort of designed as sort of a tier 1 support structure for kids with autism. We also decided to think of it as a transdiagnostic intervention. So we weren't necessarily thinking about autism. We were talking to preschool teachers about children with all kinds of social communication challenges. So it wasn't specific to autism. And that seemed important to us because if we want to work with preschool teachers in the community, they may have a kid with autism in their class 1 year, but not the 2nd year. And we wanted to design this intervention as something that they put in their tool belt overall. And the focus of the intervention, we didn't talk about autism much. We talked about active engagement and what it takes for children to be actively engaged in learning. And SEEKS has this wonderful structure that I find very useful in talking to teachers about active engagement. And Emily Rubin sort of breaks it down into investment, independence, and initiation. Almost, again, sort of a layer cake of sorts. So we're talking about investment. Let's make sure that children actually want to be there, that their bodies are oriented towards the activities, that they're motivated to participate. Let's make sure that we entice children to pay attention to the activity in hand, to hook their attention, to sustain their attention. So that's sort of what Emily Rubin talks about, investment. Independence, making sure kids know what to do, what's expected of them during the different activities, both behaviorally, in terms of following classroom rules, but then also practically what are the 5 steps of this specific activity at hand so that children understand what's expected of them at any moment in time, that they have a job. And then initiations, making sure that when we design classroom routines, there's lots of opportunities for children to communicate frequently with lots of people for lots of different reasons. So that was sort of the intervention that we tried to design. And the way we did it is we had a 10-week program that we offered. So it was a professional training program for teachers. And we decided to focus on a very specific classroom routines. And we really could have picked any here. We decided to look at large group circle time. And we could talk about whether that was the best choice, but it was a choice. But it seemed to us that people learn the best when you learn in context, when you have a specific activity or routine in mind when you learn about the things. And then we developed 4 asynchronous self-paced learning modules where teachers learned about what does active engagement mean, what does investment mean and how do I support it, what does independence mean and how do I support it during circle time, what does initiations mean and how do I support it during circle time. So we had these 4 self-paced modules, and in between each module we had a coach observe the teacher and meet with the parents to do some follow-up coaching around those specific topics. So again, it wasn't a hugely intensive intervention on the one hand. On the other hand, if you get that amount of engagement from a preschool teacher, that seems quite wonderful to me. So down here you have just a freeze frame from our online modules. We tried very hard to make it video-based, to give sort of case-based examples where teachers saw a video and there was a kid and they got to reflect on this child and the strategies that the teacher used. So it was a very interactive module. And then we did a feasibility trial of this. We worked with 25 classrooms, early childhood education classrooms, and we aimed for both public school pre-K and Head Start classrooms and private childcare classrooms. So we tried it across all these different settings. For each classroom, we recruited 1 teacher and 1 child. Even though the strategies we taught the teacher were really for all children, we used 1 child to sort of document changes. And we helped teachers, so we enrolled the teachers, and then we helped the teacher identify 1 kid that may be a good target child. If there was a kid with autism in the classroom, great, that would be a great target. Often there wasn't. So then we looked for other kids with other disabilities, other social communication concerns that parents have shared, or maybe just children who have challenges engaging in classroom routines. So essentially we worked with every teacher to find 1 child in their classroom that this is a fit for. We had a reasonably diverse sample. I think they were sort of between 2 and 5 years of age, the children. So I'm just going to talk you through some of the findings from this research. So the first question was, when you do this kind of recruitment that we did, where you first recruit a teacher and then start thinking about kids from their classroom, who are the kids that you actually find with that approach? And we found that there weren't, actually don't have the notes here, I think there were 3 or 4 kids with autism in the sample. But if we looked at sort of SRS scores, which sort of are measures of autism, is an autism screener, autism severity kind of measure, we had an average of 70, so this is a standardized score that has like a mean of 100 usually, so a couple standard deviations below average. And we also used the SSIS, and we saw a quite significant need in the sample. And that was also true when we used sort of the qualitative responses from parents about your concerns about your child and the teacher. So overall, it seemed to us that the recruitment actually worked quite nicely. That we ended up not with a sample of kids with autism, and not all of them went on to have autism, but they were all kids who needed something. And we were really glad to engage the teacher in this process. In terms of, so this was a feasibility trial, so can you actually run a program like this? It was less about what the outcomes of the children are. So we did well in terms of consenting teachers, recruiting teachers, and the kids seemed symptomatic. We did quite well in terms of completion. So if you look here at the percentage of teachers who completed the entire SEEKS program, so 3/4 of them made it through it. If you look at the percentage of teachers, 80%, 79% of teachers completed at least 3 of these online modules. 74% spend at least an hour and a half completing the module, 3 hours completing those modules. 79% completed at least 2 coaching sessions. Most of them completed the outcome measures. So overall, we were amazed. I was amazed. I mean, these are preschool teachers. In private childcare centers, there's no paid time for professional development often. public school teachers, they already have lots on their plates that the school system wants them to do. So for that entire group to take that amount of time to learn about how to support kids with social communication challenge during circle time seemed like a really great success to us. In terms of child outcomes, or in terms of fidelity, we didn't quite have significant gains in observed fidelity, although what we did see is teacher self-efficacy increased quite a bit before and after. So there was no control group here, it was just a pre-post test. So that made us feel good as well. And then in terms of outcomes, we had nice treatment effects on teacher-student relationship. So these are teacher self-reports. We had not quite significant, but some small treatment effect on child active engagement. And we had a quite nice effect on teacher-reported social-emotional skills using the SSIS. So overall, to us, it seemed that in terms of feasibility, it seemed feasible to us, although it was quite a beast. It was not an easy project to do. Overall, the treatment gains seemed reasonable to us. We were very proud of gains in teacher-student relationship, which is really important. And the fact that we had a signal on social communication skills seemed also really great. Obviously, and this is just the first of many studies, and really what needs to happen now is to see what an intervention of this, how it actually impacts children's learning. Just going to look at the time real quick. Just going to put a brief plug in here. We're doing a similar study right now. So if you work for any preschools, or if you know any preschools, have them reach out to us. This time we're not focusing on circle time. This time we're focusing on what teachers can do to engage parents, and specifically parents of kids who have social communication challenges. So here we're empowering the teachers, we're giving them the skills and the tools to run 3 play groups with the parents. So this time each teacher recruits 2 families, parent and children, and then usually 2 teachers collaborate in running a play group. So we have play groups of 2 teachers, 4 children, 4 parents. And during these play groups, so there's a sequence of 3, so they happen once a month. Where the teachers take the parents through a little mock preschool day, circle time to open, circle time to close, 4 activities layered throughout, some art, some more chore related, some more play related. So different kinds of activities, each 10 minutes long, where teachers and parents collaboratively go through these activities. And in the context of these activities, teachers remind the parents about strategies to support, again, investment, independence, and communication or initiations. So that's sort of our study that we're doing right now. It's again the same idea. So for this study, we spent a whole year. For the other study too, we spent the first year talking to stakeholders, teachers, parents about what's feasible. And I think when you work in preschool settings, the biggest question is what's actually feasible. Obviously, we wanted many more than 3 play group sessions for these kids. But when you think about early childhood education, when you think about the fact that there's kids in there that may go on to have autism, but nobody's talking about it yet, that seemed to us from our conversation and interviews that that's sort of a realistic way to support teacher, student, parent relationships in that setting. All right, so this is now my venture into the early childhood education world. And this is the UNT Kristen Farmer Autism Center. So this is not, this is a center designed for kids with autism. And it was founded, I think, 12 or 13 years ago. So it's been around for a while, and during these 12 years, a lot has changed. When I came 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, the KFAC had survived COVID, which was a major feat. It was much bigger before COVID in terms of students that were seeking treatment. When I came, it had sort of shrunk and then sort of bounced back okay. When I came to it, most of the revenue almost entirely came through ABA insurance billing. There was some small state grants and some Texas Workforce Commission funding, but for the most part, it's ABA insurance funding. And that, it wasn't just COVID. I mean, right around the time of COVID, the ABA field has really changed. Lots of venture capital companies starting ABA centers. So the competition out there, or the other options for families, were just much more available. Insurance funding for ABA was obviously available at that time. So I wasn't here 12 years ago when KFAC was started, but it wasn't designed to be what it is now, which is essentially a provider of ABA services. And it doesn't mean that it has to stay that either, but that's sort of where we are at this point. But if you run an ABA clinic, a building for kids with autism, the word inclusion is not the first word that comes to mind. And how parent training works in ABA settings is also a little bit of a different beast. So I've been very interested in so I've thought about what naturalistic teaching means at home, and I thought about what it means in early childhood education settings. And that's easy to think about because lots of naturalistic things happen there. When you go in a building like this, nothing naturalistic happens in a building like that unless you create it. So that was sort of my big revelation, really, that unless we teach our behavior technicians how to do a circle time, or how to play with children, or how to pretend with children, or how to sing songs with children, or like all these things that preschool teachers just know, our behavior technicians don't necessarily know. So thinking about that building from a naturalistic lens is sort of a side of the NDBI endeavor that I didn't think about before I came here, and I don't think many people have thought about. So I published this paper with Becky Lander and other people where we talked about sort of the NACI guidelines, so the professional guidelines for preschool teachers, and how they sort of align with the NDBI framework, and we found lots of alignment. Really, it's a very similar language that's spoken in those two documents. And people have started to think also about NDBI's fit into ABA, and in fact, many researchers would say, well, this is just a version of ABA. So Giacomo Vivanti wrote this beautiful paper where he sort of item by item explained why the early start Denver model is a version of ABA. And I think you can do that very much at the level of learning theory. But ABA is not just a learning theory at this point. It's really a service delivery model that involves insurance regulations, that involves certification and licensing, that involves task lists of what providers are supposed to know, that involves insurance regulations of what needs to be documented and done and how it needs to be done. So I've really started to think of ABA much less about a theory of learning, which is what I thought about in graduate school, and much more as just a service delivery system. And there are huge frontiers in that. I put here a graph of the number of behavior analysts that are being certified. So this is going back to 1999, where 2004 it's just an exponential number. And that's very obvious to us when we hire behavior analysts at this point. It's almost impossible to hire them because the need is so huge. And what behavior analysts with a master's degree in behavior analysts sort of come with is not a whole lot. And I put one more graph here of the people who actually do the work, which are these behavior technicians. So if you look at the number of behavior technicians that are being certified, I mean, these are 190,000 people. So this is a huge workforce. So I don't know if this is obvious to you guys, but behavior technicians To be an RBT, you need a high school degree and 40 hours of an online course, and then some on-the-job training that's more or less structured. How long do they stay? That's a very good question. I don't think we know that yet. So, from my perspective, I think when I think about pre-service education or training for behavior analysts, everything that I told you about NDBIs is not part of what people learn there. It may come up, but the truth is ABA prides itself in not being an autism-specific theory, right? It prides itself in being sort of applicable to training animals as much as, working with elderly or employment settings. So it's a very universal theory of learning. So just the focus on autism is not necessarily dominant in ABA training programs. And then this idea of naturalistic teaching is not as dominant as my presentation made it sound. So I think there's a ways to go in thinking about pre-service training for behavior analysts. And then what I'm particularly excited about is at UNT, one thing that sets us apart at KFAC is that we have behavior technicians that are usually we have about 60 behavior technicians working for us, which is a huge group, and most of them are students. And they're undergraduate students from speech-language pathology, from early childhood education, from psychology, from social work. So they all come to us with a passion for autism, often a sibling with autism, some beautiful interest in autism. And to me, it sort of seems like if I could spend the next decade of my life finding a way to keep up with training that workforce in ways that is really, really prepares them for implementing the kind of treatment we want to do. That seems like a wonderful second half of my career to me. So I've been thinking much more at this point about what naturalistic teaching really means when it comes to these settings. And I think part of it means that we need to rethink our priorities and the insurance incentives. These settings should make it much easier not to deliver all services one-on-one, but to work in groups. They should make it much more easier to allow enrolling children in focused treatments for a little bit of time a week, rather than comprehensive treatments where kids spend all the time with you. They should make it much easier for children to transition into ABA and also out of ABA, going back to school. So I think a lot of the incentives for running these kind of programs would benefit from makeover, where we really get ourselves in a position where we can provide focused treatments, where we can transition kids to school, which is a hard things to do at this point. And I think also in the context of KFAC specifically, sort of thinking about how do we adequately prepare this workforce or these undergraduate students for careers in autism, by really being mindful about training them to not just learn about how to create or engineer reinforcement structures, but to also think about how you engage children in meaningful, playful activities where learning can happen. I'm just going to leave it at that and open the floor for conversations and discussion. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah.
This is so wonderful. I love this. My question is the coaching aspect. Monitoring component. Do you have a sense that your diagnosis even better at it? Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about heritability of autism, that there's a heritable component, and parents sometimes share some of the milder subvariants of their children's traits. I mean, this is a question that has come up, since I started working with parents, even going back to this first study, was how do I know that this variation in how parents talk to children isn't just a reflection of who parents are? I don't think I have a great answer to it. One of the things that I found really striking, or one of the things that really interested me about this parent coaching project that we've had, I don't think anyone has done this, where they sort of interviewed parents before and after to talk more broadly about their children, to sort of get at the extent to which they can think flexibly about their children, whether they can pay attention to their children. And the fact that overall parents of kids with autism didn't do particularly bad on this task. They didn't seem to have more struggles with that task than other parents, but there was huge variation, just like there is with all parents. So yes, as parents, our own genetic makeup always gets in our way. That's true for all of us as parents. And we always are who we are in our relationships with our children. And some of the challenges that parents face when interacting with a kid with autism, is hard. But I think in my head, I usually think about just variation of parenting out there, rather than think about sort of the parents' genetic contributions to it. I mean, I think what you see when you do this insightfulness interview is how it's called. So essentially you spend an hour talking to parents. You show them some videos of their children. You ask, what is your child thinking? What are they feeling? And then you follow up with questions like when they say, oh, I see my child be surprised. And you ask them, well, are there other times from everyday life where your child is surprised like that? You ask the parents what's typical for their child and whether they can give you examples. So a lot of this sort of cognitive flexibility, social awareness, it shows up in these conversations. And there's definitely parents who struggle with these conversations. Some parents don't see the point in it. I mean, usually the way it breaks down, half the parents do really well. A quarter of the parents don't engage in the conversation. It's surprising to think about what your child is to them, to think about what their child is thinking or doing. And then there's the other quarter, which they call one-sided, which tend to be the parents who just have so much worry in their life about their child, about their job, about all kinds of things, that all that worry makes it hard for them to look at their child. And I think especially that, I mean, these are all sort of differences among parents that I see all around me, whether there's a genetic vulnerability for autism in the family history or not. So that's where my head goes, sort of being compassionate about the fact that parenting is hard and that parents are whole people who bring their own baggage. And in the end, if we can help them make it work, it would be really great. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a great answer.
Yeah.
Well, this is very exciting and interesting to think about both your intervention with the preschool, Head Start, teachers, and also with the parents. And this is maybe a simple question, but I don't know your sense of this. So you had both self-paced video modules that the teachers could engage in, and then you also had coaching. Any sense of whether one method or the other was more effective or more utilized? Any sense of that? I think, there's research showing that typical professional development doesn't take anybody very far. And even though they don't have it, and that's very sad, what they don't have, that's not necessarily the best way to go. And so you took it 2 steps further. Any sense of your sense of what you would do again?
I started doing hybrid teaching at Hunter College in 2009. Because I sort of decided that this was very exciting. And what I loved about it was this sort of idea of a flipped classroom, where you first have students engage with the material on their own, and then you have classroom time to really elaborate and apply and talk through it. So to me, as a college instructor, that makes a lot of sense to structure it that way. It requires that the online teaching is good though. And I think part of what made this good, or what's always made it good, is there's lots of videos. Because I think there's so much benefit in teachers seeing other teachers do things with other kids. So we worked very hard to curate sort of a video library for teachers. I think we had, I don't know, at least 25 classroom videos embedded where teachers reflected on it. And I find that really helpful. But on their own, I don't think it does much either. So I think it needs some coaching component as well. But I feel like this hybrid approach is a good way, I think, to go. It's so hard to find in preschool settings to get on their professional development calendar. Maybe for one professional development day you can, but to have this sort of more sustained is just really hard. So this in many ways is a compromise between what seems feasible in that setting. I mean, even for me as a center director, getting our RBTs to participate in professional development all at the same time, these 65 students, it's just so hard to accomplish. Yeah.
I have a question about your second, when you were talking about embedding naturalistic intervention in inclusive childcare setting. Your table about like teacher adherence and like your recruitment success is it's like so amazing. I started to do a little bit of outreach now that I'm a faculty, and I find it hard. Partly it's because when I doing my graduate program, I wasn't trained to do outreach, and now when we're doing research, we really need to do a lot of outreach. So I was wondering, you said the teachers weren't like they didn't get PD professional development credits, but the teachers were motivated to participate. Like, what motivates them? And I also wonder, like, were there things that you were intentionally doing to get them interested in participating?
Yeah. I mean, I shouldn't have said that there's no PD in early childhood education. There certainly is. It all differs by system. So the rules and regulation at Head Start are very different than the rules and regulation in public school run pre-K are very different than in a private child care center. So the amount of time teachers have differs vastly. And I mean, these are really very different settings. And I think that sort of was one of the questions that sort of came up after the study is, so if we would do a large trial of it, which setting would we work in? Would we work in public school-based pre-K, which is certainly one way to go. There were unique challenges about this. One of the strengths is that in public schools, there's a certain number of regulated professional development days. That's just, you know, one of the challenges was that teachers very often didn't have full freedom in designing their own circle time. There was lots of things that were done in the school in a certain way. So it had strengths and challenges. Head Start has lots of opportunities because they have a whole set of staff that are there to support families. It's not just the teacher. At the same time, they have, you know, work with families that need a lot, where some of this may seem like like a small drop in a bucket. So I think it's worth to really think about these different systems quite differently and what they need. I don't have an easy answer. I mean, we're certainly struggling to find preschools to do this with. And, you know, there's just, I mean, we struggled to make a preschool fund itself at Marcus, and it was an endless uphill battle. We had a pre-K grant for the 4-year-olds. It wasn't enough. So, I mean, it's a really tough business, and you have a workforce that you don't pay, nobody pays enough, that have the weight of society's challenges on their shoulders. So it's really hard. But I do think, I mean, especially with this parent-teacher relationship project, you know, if you don't set it up, if you don't find ways to communicate with parents effectively up front, the problems are going to show up on the back end. But I don't have a magic sauce. I mean, to me, I think it helped having directed a preschool before, just because I know the strain that people are under. And I don't think 10 years ago I would have been excited about teachers doing 180 minutes of online modules. But I think looking at it now from my perspective, it's great, because usually what they do is I was just talking to my son about his driver's ed training that he does. It's like a 35 hours I think you have to do. And he said, I'm going to do it in 7 hours. And, and that's what teachers do. I mean, they click through these online modules, online trainings that they're supposed to do, and it's not used for anything. So I think you've got to be very realistic about what teachers can and want to do. So this year that I spent talking to directors and teachers and parents about what this could look like was a well-invested year.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. But thank you so much. This was really informative.
Thank you guys for coming.